I realized my money no longer felt like it belonged to me long before I could point to anything missing. There was no loss event, no alarm, just a quiet shift in how decisions were being made and how rarely they required me. I was 49 and recently widowed in the administrative sense, not the emotional one. The marriage had ended years before the paperwork finally caught up. What I inherited wasn't grief but liquidity. A buyout, a deferred compensation plan, and a townhouse I no longer needed but hadn't sold yet. I worked as a regional operations director for a hospital network, process, compliance, escalation paths. My authority had always been quiet and procedural. He worked nights. That's how we met, at a 24-hour diner near the hospital campus, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never tasted fresh. I went there after late shifts because it created a boundary between work and home. He was usually at the counter, laptop open, half-eaten fries cooling beside him, like someone who'd planned to be there a while. The first night, he asked if the outlet near my booth worked better. He said his battery was unreliable. I said yes and shifted my bag without thinking. That was the entire interaction. The second night, he nodded instead of speaking. The third, he asked if I worked in medicine because I looked tired in a specific way. I said administration. He said that explained the posture. He told me he was a graduate student in bioinformatics, funded but barely. He said his stipend covered rent and not much else, and that nights were when his thinking settled. He said he liked places that didn't hurry him. He offered this information the way people do when they're being accurate, not impressive. I noticed how carefully he spoke about himself. No ambition statements. No hardship performance. Just logistics. Over the next few weeks, our schedules began to overlap with regularity. First, we didn't sit together. Then we did. He never ordered before I arrived. He said eating alone lost its appeal once conversation entered the equation. One night, he asked if I could look at something for him. Not an assignment. An email. He said it was from his department chair and that the tone felt off. He said academic language sometimes concealed intent. I read it. It was vague. Non-committal. I told him so. I suggested a reply that clarified expectations without sounding defensive. He typed it exactly as I said. When the response came back positive, he smiled. Not proudly, but with relief. After that, he asked occasionally. About phrasing. About structure. About how to apply pressure without triggering resistance. He said I understood institutions. I said institutions behaved predictably if you stayed long enough to learn their reflexes. We didn't touch for months. When we did, it was after a night when he'd been unusually quiet. He said a funding decision had been delayed. He said delays were worse than rejection because they suspended planning. I listened. I didn't fix it. In the car afterward, he said he felt calmer with me. He said I didn't rush solutions. He said that made him feel more capable, not less. I told myself that was healthy. When he asked if he could list me as an emergency contact just for the semester, I said yes without thinking about it. He said it was a formality for lab access. He said no one ever used it. I signed where he pointed. That felt like nothing. After that, he stopped calling me by my first name in public. Not deliberately. Just happened. At the diner to the server, he said she. At the lab, when someone passed by and nodded, he said my contact. It sounded neutral. Protective, even. I didn't correct it. He began telling me more about the lab. Not the science. The structure. Who signed what? Which approvals bottlenecked? Which administrators mattered more than their titles suggested? He listened closely when I answered. He didn't argue. He calibrated. I noticed how quickly he learned which details to bring me and which to resolve alone. He said his advisor was supportive but distracted. He said grant cycles made everyone skittish. He said he worried about being invisible. Not overlooked, invisible. That distinction mattered to him. I told him invisibility could be temporary if you chose the right moments to surface. He remembered that. The first call came on a Sunday afternoon. A number I didn't recognize. It was campus security. They asked if I was listed as an emergency contact for a graduate student who hadn't badged out of a restricted area overnight. I said yes. I said I could reach him. When I called, he answered immediately. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he'd stayed late running simulations and lost track of time. He said the system flagged inactivity as presence. I relayed that. Security thanked me. The call ended. He texted an apology. He said he hated putting me in that position. He said he'd update the form. He didn't. After that, my phone rang more often. Not crises. Clarifications. Verification calls. A lab manager asking if I could confirm that a delay was expected. An administrator asking whether an exception had been discussed. Each time my answer smoothed something. Each time the call ended quickly. I told myself this was proximity, not responsibility. He began staying over on nights when experiments ran long. He said it was easier than commuting back to campus housing. He left early. He folded the blanket. He didn't take up space the way some men did. He also stopped talking about money, not because it improved, because it became abstract. He spoke about funding environments instead of rent, cycles instead of bills. I noticed the shift and didn't comment on it. One night, he mentioned a stipend adjustment that hadn't come through. He said payroll was behind. He said it would correct itself. He said he wasn't worried. I offered to cover groceries for a week. He hesitated, then accepted. He said he'd repay me as soon as the system caught up. The system caught up slowly. In the meantime, I paid for small things without noticing. Meals, gas, software he needed access to just temporarily. None of it registered as support. Felt like continuity. He began asking my opinion before sending emails. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he trusted my read. He said tone mattered more than content in unstable systems. I watched how his language changed. Less tentative, more precise. He stopped asking for extensions and started proposing revised timelines. He stopped apologizing and started contextualizing. People responded. One evening, he said something that stuck. He said I had a way of making institutions behave. He said I didn't fight them. I anticipated them. He said being near that made him feel less exposed. I told myself that exposure was part of growth. I didn't ask where the line was between being near and being used. The first time I covered for him in writing, it felt administrative. It was an email to a compliance office, copied to 3 people who mattered and 2 who didn't. They wanted confirmation that an overnight data run had been authorized under an existing protocol. He was on a call. He said it would be easier if I replied because I knew how to phrase things so they stopped asking questions. I wrote that the activity fell within approved parameters and that any anomalies would be documented retroactively. It was accurate enough to be true. It closed the thread. He thanked me like you thank someone who hands you a coat. Automatically. After that, the requests acquired rhythm. Could I review a justification memo before submission? Could I confirm verbally that a delay had been anticipated? Could I be copied so things didn't get misinterpreted? Each time the ask came wrapped in efficiency. Each time my involvement reduced friction. I noticed how his stress levels dropped as mine absorbed the variance. He began talking about me as if I were a fixed point. He said it once when he was tired. He said it again later more clearly. He said knowing I was there made it easier to take risks. He said he could stretch because I was holding the line. I didn't correct him because the metaphor felt flattering. Anchors are strong. They keep things from drifting. The first significant expense appeared disguised as urgency. A software license renewal. Specialized. Short-term. He said the department would reimburse it. But that procurement moved slowly, and that missing the window would push his project back months. He said he hated asking. He said he wouldn't if it weren't critical. I paid for it while he watched, embarrassed but grateful. He said he'd submit the receipt immediately. Reimbursement came back partial. The department covered less than expected. He said it was a classification issue. He said it would be corrected next cycle. I didn't push. The amount wasn't large enough to justify friction. What changed was how easily I began to justify my involvement. I told myself this was temporary. that academic systems were notoriously clumsy, that I was simply smoothing edges until things stabilized. I'd done that professionally for years. This was just closer to home. He began sharing passwords with me. Not deliberately, casually. He said it was easier if I could check status without interrupting him. He said he trusted me. He said he knew I wouldn't misuse access. I didn't want the access. I took it anyway. Late one night, I logged into a portal to check a submission status. I noticed a form in progress under my name. Not forged. Selected. My information filled in as secondary administrator on a grant application I hadn't seen. I stared at it longer than necessary. When I asked him about it the next morning, he said it was provisional. He said the system required a non-student contact to advance to the next stage. He said it didn't mean anything unless the grant was awarded. I asked why he hadn't mentioned it. He said he'd meant to. He said things moved fast. He said he didn't want to involve me unless it mattered. That explanation felt reasonable. It also felt rehearsed. I told him to remove my name. He did. Immediately. Without complaint. The speed of compliance reassured me more than it should have. After that, I noticed how often he framed things as almost resolved. Funding almost confirmed. Approvals almost through. Reviews almost done. The future stayed perpetually one step ahead of closure. I began to feel tired in a way that wasn't physical. One evening, sitting across from him at the diner, I realized I was no longer there to decompress. I was there to listen for what needed to be steadied next. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said he didn't know how he'd gotten this far without me. I smiled because that's what you do when someone credits you with their balance. Inside something shifted, not alarm exactly. Load. The break didn't come from discovery. Came from confirmation. I was in my office late, finishing a quarterly review, when an email came through from a compliance unit I knew well. Not my hospital network, adjacent. Academic but cautious. They were requesting clarification on an authorization chain tied to a data use exception. My name was on it. Not copied. Referenced. I read the message slowly. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. They were asking whether I had agreed to act as institutional liaison for a research activity that exceeded a student's scope. I hadn't. I didn't forward it to him right away. I opened the attachment. It was a summary memo, cleanly written, outlining justification, risk mitigation, and oversight. My role was described as external administrative sponsor, not signer, not approver, sponsor. The language was careful, plausible, familiar in the way institutional phrasing always is when it's designed to travel. When I called him, I didn't raise my voice. I asked when he'd submitted the exception. He paused. Then he said it must have been bundled with another request. He said systems sometimes auto-populated roles based on prior interactions. He said he'd never claimed I'd approved anything explicitly. I asked whether he'd corrected it once he saw my name. He said he hadn't noticed. That was the first answer that didn't fit. I told him I needed him to withdraw the request immediately and notify compliance that my involvement had been overstated. He said withdrawing would raise flags. He said exceptions were easier to justify than reversals. He said attention was the real risk. I said attention was already present. He softened then. He said he was under pressure. He said timelines were collapsing. He said he felt like everything he'd built was about to evaporate because of technicalities. He said he hadn't meant to put me in a position where my integrity was adjacent to his survival. That word survival landed differently than care. I told him I wouldn't cover for him again. Not verbally. Not in writing. I said my name was not infrastructure. He nodded. He said he understood. The next morning, compliance called me directly. They thanked me for flagging the issue and said they'd received clarification from the student that I had not authorized representation. They said they appreciated my transparency. When I asked how my name had been included in the first place, they said it had been referenced repeatedly in prior communications as a point of stability. Not approval. Stability. That afternoon, I asked him to come over. I told him the relationship needed to change. not end change. I said my role had shifted without my consent, and that I needed distance from anything that blurred responsibility. He listened carefully. Then he said something precise. He said he thought I liked being needed. He said I seemed most alive when things were unresolved. He said he'd assumed my involvement meant I wanted proximity to consequence, not distance from it. The statement wasn't angry. It was analytical. I told him I liked clarity. He said clarity was a luxury in unstable systems. I said then we were no longer compatible. He packed quietly. He didn't argue. He said he hoped I didn't think he'd been manipulating me. He said he'd just been adapting faster than the system expected. When he left, the apartment felt larger than it had in months. Not emptier, wider. That night, I slept without interruption. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as cleanup. 2 days after he moved out, compliance sent a follow-up. They weren't investigating me. They were documenting distance. They asked for a brief statement confirming I had no ongoing role in his research activities and no intention to assume one retroactively. I wrote it in 12 lines. Neutral. Final. I sent it back before lunch. That afternoon, another message arrived. This one from the university's grants office. They said an application had been withdrawn due to insufficient administrative sponsorship. They thanked me for my prior engagement and wished me well. That phrasing caught. Prior engagement. I replied once, clarifying that any engagement had been informal and concluded. They acknowledged it within the hour. After that, the system adjusted quickly. His access badges were deactivated. His project page stopped updating. The portal where my name had briefly lived returned to blank fields. No one asked follow-up questions. No one apologized. Institutions rarely do. He texted once. He said things had fallen apart faster than he expected. He said he'd underestimated how much his work relied on perceived stability. He said he hoped I didn't regret helping him when things were uncertain. I read the message carefully. It was framed as gratitude, but it carried an accounting tone. What had been given, what had been lost, what might still be owed emotionally. I didn't respond. Over the next week, I noticed small things detaching. Calendar reminders disappeared. Shared documents closed themselves out. Emails stopped being forwarded to me for tone checks or reassurance. The flow of almost problems dried up. What surprised me was how quickly my attention returned to its proper scale. At work, decisions took less time. At home, evenings felt longer. I cooked without listening for his key in the lock. I slept without anticipating interruption. A colleague asked casually whether I'd been consulting on a research project. I said no. She accepted that immediately and moved on. The story had already ended everywhere but in his head. The final contact came as a voicemail. He said he was sorry if he'd crossed lines he hadn't seen clearly. He said he hadn't meant to make me responsible for his outcomes. He said he hoped, with time, I'd remember the good parts more than the strain. I listened once. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger. Because memory doesn't need instruction. The quiet afterward wasn't empty. It was orderly. I noticed it first in the mornings. I stopped checking my phone before getting out of bed. There were no overnight messages that needed triage, no half-formed explanations waiting to be softened. My day began where it was supposed to begin, with my own body, my own schedule. At work, my name returned to its proper function. Not as reassurance, not as implication, just as authority within a defined perimeter. I signed what I meant to sign. I spoke only where I was responsible. That distinction felt clean. One evening, weeks later, I went back to the diner. Same booth. Same cracked vinyl. Same coffee that tasted faintly burnt. He wasn't there. I hadn't expected him to be. I ordered anyway and sat with the quiet hum of other people's lives moving past me. I realized then that I hadn't lost anything tangible. No money that mattered. No reputation. No standing. What I had lost was a role I hadn't agreed to audition for, the stabilizer, the translator, the borrowed spine. Letting it go didn't feel like grief. Felt like subtraction. At home, I gathered the last few documents that had his name threaded through them. Emails printed for reference. Notes I'd made while helping him shape arguments that were never mine. I shredded them slowly, listening to the machine work through each page. I didn't keep souvenirs. Later that night, I stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. They were steady, indifferent, systems working without my supervision. That too felt right. In bed, I noticed how my breathing settled without effort. No anticipation, no readiness, just rest. Before sleep, one thought surfaced, not sharp, not bitter. I had mistaken proximity for partnership. The correction didn't hurt. It clarified.